This screencast is going to look at Summer 2016 Question 4, focusing on foreign exchange risk. So you can have a read through the question and the requirements to make sure you're fully up to speed before you watch through this screencast. So in this foreign exchange question, there was three main requirements. Again, part A was a calculation or numerical type requirement where you're asked, Eagle is considering hedging the exposure using one of the following options. So a forward, a money market, and currency options. And then you were asked for each of the three hedges, show the net cost of the goods to Eagle if the Chinese currency, Chinese yuan, appreciates by 10% and if it depreciates. So again, this is a very standard one if you looked at past exam questions where you're given a number of different hedging techniques and you're asked to run the numbers based on two different scenarios. So we're going to look through that and how to deal with that, and I'll give you a four-step approach of how to deal with those standard type foreign exchange risk questions. And based on part A, then you go to part B, and assuming they do decide to hedge the exposure, you need to advise Eagle on which approach to use and give reasons for recommendation. So again, sometimes part A and B will be subsumed together. This time they're separate, but they are worth 16 marks in total. So you need to first do the numbers and do the calculations here, and use your results from here then to give a recommendation and give a justification for which option or which alternative you chose. Finally, then part C is more of a generic risk question around critically assess the arguments made by Alan and Emma regarding whether to hedge the currency exposure and advise an appropriate policy. So again, this is a common one that has appeared a number of times. It's the pros and cons of hedging and whether they should or should not engage in that practice. So again, when you get a chance now, go back up, have a read through the question. We'll just have a look at the core basics. Eagle itself is an importer of goods, so it's importing from China, therefore it's buying goods in Chinese yuan, and it's obviously going to sell them in euro, so it is exposed to foreign exchange movements. So we're given a bit of background here in terms of they have a big order in place for 1.2 million Chinese yuan, payable in 6 months, and again, the finance director Alan feels that the hedging is too expensive and there's no real need for it. Whereas the managing director Emma says, due to the scale of the order, she's a bit apprehensive about the potential risk involved, and therefore she feels the costs are justified. So again, that will link to part C in terms of who is right, and you're asked to go back to part C. Critically assess, meaning look at the pros and cons. So always watch for the verb there. And then we're given some information about the relevant interest rates, the spot exchange rate, and of course more detail on the forward and currency for the two relevant options. So the first protocol then is to deal with part A, the actual calculations. Now, one thing I tell students is this is a very common examination question, and there are a number of different types of what essentially are derivatives that come up both in a foreign exchange context and also in an interest rate context. And bearing in mind the Cap2 is an open book exam, I always tell students to come up with something like this. Again, it's a kind of an overview cheat sheet type approach where you look at each of the different type of instruments, or you could call them derivatives, or approaches to hedging, and you give a summary of what these are. So what is an option, what is a swap, what is the money market, and then how is that applied to the foreign exchange context, and how is it applied to interest rate context. So each of these separate boxes could be a study session on their own, maybe 10 to 15 minutes. And what I've done here, now some of these questions are old that you can update them. I've given the past exam question where it's come up, and also a reference to the Anne-Marie Ward finance textbook of where you'll find relevant examples. So that's just a useful example for you to how you might structure your studying for the calculative element of foreign exchange and also interest rate risk. Okay, so that's just an idea there in terms of how you might structure it to provide you a kind of a cheat sheet approach that if something comes up in the exam, then you have a good example to go to of how that is done, and also for any key issues that you might have to remember, certain mistakes that you might always make. So looking at part A then, we're asked for, we have three different hedging techniques to use, and we have to run it under two different scenarios. So these are a common type structure of a question that comes up, and I always tell students having a structured approach to the question that will allow you to maximize your marks for the time invested. So I typically tell students to take 4 steps. The first one be to understand the position, and this means the position of the business and what risks they are facing. In our context here, we're looking at a company which is an importer from China, and they're placing an order in the Chinese currency. Therefore, they're going to be afraid. You always ask yourself, what are they afraid of happening? Well, they're going to be afraid that the Chinese yuan will appreciate, because the stronger the Chinese yuan is, the more euros they're going to have to pay to buy the goods in Chinese yuan. So they're afraid that the Chinese yuan is going to appreciate in value, and also more importantly is this is a very large order. For any potential swing in foreign exchange risk or foreign exchange currencies could have a material impact on the business. So that is what I talk about with step 1. It's really just to understand what are they afraid of. They're afraid that the Chinese yuan is going to appreciate because it's going to cost them more in euro to buy the goods. And they're also afraid because it's a very large order, so it could have a material impact on the business. The second step then is identify the options, and this is really what I say to set out the architecture of the question. In this case, what options are available? Well, you have 3, so you can call them alternatives. You have a forward, you have the money market, and you have currency options. So they are the 3 hedging techniques available. And secondly, you have 2 different scenarios. So the 2 scenarios are the current spot rate appreciates by 10% or depreciates. And I always tell students, so we'll stop at step 2 there, go back. Essentially, what you're looking for a final result or final table is something like this, where you have the forward, you have the money market, and you have the options. There are your 3 alternatives, and the net cost then is under 2 scenarios. We call scenario 1, 10% appreciation, and then you have scenario 2, 10% depreciation. So if you do out a table like that, what I would do is I'd put this in the front of my answer, leave a little small table like that, so we'll do it here just to make it more defined. This is what you want to fill in. So essentially what you want to have at the end is, you want to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You want to have 6 different numbers that you can put in for the cost of each of the alternatives under 2 scenarios. So I leave that at the start, and that will allow me to fill in the numbers and then neatly make some comments for part B, making the advice and basing the recommendations. I then come down to my appendix, so appendix, and I do working 1, working 2, working 3 for each of them. So that's the way I tell students, and that's regardless whether it's interest rate risk or foreign exchange risk. You put the need table there, that's the infrastructure of the question, as per option 2. And then step 3 then is to run the numbers. Do the calculations in an appendix and keep neat. And then finally step 4 is to present. So present summary tables in summary calculations in the table, and you have this already done that you can slot in as you go along, and then give insight or conclude where necessary. And again, you are required here in part B to give a conclusion. Therefore you can make a nice neat conclusion because you can see all the numbers and they're not hidden behind any calculations. So that is the 4 steps. Understand the position, set up the architecture of the question, the number of hedging alternatives you have, and the number of scenarios you're looking at. Then run the numbers under each alternative, and then finally present it neatly and make some solid conclusions, because there typically will be marks going for that. So if we go back to the question, we have 3 to do: forward, money market, and currency option. I always tell students start with the easiest one. If there is an alternative, and sometimes there is, of an unhedged or do nothing, that is typically the most straightforward one to start with. So although it's not here, we'll have a look at how the unhedged, or how would you actually calculate the unhedged portion. So here we have to first figure out what are the spot rates under both scenarios. So what do we expect the spot rate to be for both the scenarios based on what we're told? Well, if 10% appreciates or 10% depreciates. So if the spot rate, we'll start with appreciates by 10%, it'll be 7.24112, which is the spot rate here, times 0.9, so times 90%, gets you to 6.517. Now you will notice in the suggested solution they come up with a slightly different one of 6.58. What they do is divide by 1.1. So again, you can interpret either way. Typically you'd multiply by 0.9 if you're looking for a 10% appreciation. And a lot of students kind of get confused, and why would the spot rate be falling if it's appreciating? But you have to think about it in euro terms. If the Chinese yuan is appreciating, that means the euro is depreciating. So 1 euro is going to get you less Chinese yuan. So it's slightly counterintuitive in terms of how you look at it at face value. And the opposite is the same for if the Chinese yuan is depreciating, well then the spot rate relative to euro is going to be higher, times 1.1, so 7.965. So again, because the Chinese yuan is depreciating, that means 1 euro is going to be worth more Chinese yuan, hence it's going to be worth 7.965. So that is one thing just to watch. So these are the two spot rates based on the two scenarios. And of course, if you had unhedged, so again, I'll just put in unhedged here just for illustration. It's not part of the question, but again, it's good for tutorial purposes. Well, the unhedged cost here will be 1.2 million divided by the spot rate, and the unhedged cost there will be 1.2 million divided by the spot rate prevailing. So have a look there and see, is that consistent with what we initially feared based on our step 1? Because this is good. Remember we said the fear here was that the Chinese yuan would appreciate, because then it would cost the company more in euro terms to buy the goods. And if we look at the numbers here then, if the Chinese yuan appreciates, it's going to cost us 184,000 euros, whereas if it depreciates, 150,000. So again, that is consistent with our initial fear that if the Chinese yuan appreciates, it's going to cost us more, and there's a swing there of 34,000 euro. So again, in the context of the overall company, that could be very material. So I said that is the typical, this most straightforward one if you do get that option of the unhedged, or sometimes it's called do nothing, but in this case we weren't, but just to illustrate. So the first one we were told we look at working one is the forward. We're given some information here that the Eagles Bank will provide a forward rate. A fee of 0.5% of the covered amount is payable initially at outset, and the forward rate will be determined on market conditions. So sometimes you are told what the forward rate is. So remember, a forward rate locks in a rate for some time in the future, in this case 6 months. So that gives you complete certainty, no downside risk, but also no upside potential. So you lock in a rate for 6 months time. Now in this case you're going to have to calculate what the forward rate is. So you should have look in the relevant chapter in the Anne-Marie Ward textbook. I'll just pull it up here in the net. It's called the interest rate parity. So this theory essentially says that you can derive the forward rate from the differences in the interest rates in both currencies, or both countries. So the forward rate, and I'll just snip this, the forward rate will be the spot rate times 1 plus the overseas rate, which is the Chinese rate, divided by 1 plus the domestic rate, which is the euro rate in this context. So if I just paste that in, so we need to get the 6-month Chinese rate and the 6-month domestic rate. So 6-month euro rate and the 6-month, I'll just put Y for the Chinese currency rate. So we typically use the borrowing rate here, and you can use the deposit rate if you wish, but just be consistent. So this is 6% divided by 2 and 8% divided by 2. So remember, you are given the yearly rates, so you're told 1 year, so you need to get them in the 6 months, because that's all you're hedging is 6 months time. So the forward rate then you can work out using the formula. It will be the spot rate 24112 times 1 plus the overseas rate divided by 1 plus the euro rate. So the expected rate in 6 months time is 7.31142. Alright, and the one little trick to remember here is whichever currency has the higher interest rate will likely to depreciate over the period. So because the Chinese yuan has a higher interest rate, the currency depreciates slightly, so it's gone from 7.24 up to 7.311. So remember, we said the higher the rate goes, it's actually depreciating. So that's a little trick to make sure you have the calc done right. The higher interest rate currency will depreciate for the forward rate, so it's worth less. So this is the forward rate we can lock in. So that means then the cost in 6 months will be 1200, so 1.2 million divided by 7.31142. So the net cost in 6 months time will be 164,127. Now remember, there is an additional cost in there as well. There is a fee of 0.5%. Right? and that 0.5% is based on the euro amount. So we're going to pay a fee up front, so times 0.005 of about 820. So 821 up front, 0.5% of 164,127. And remember, that is today. So we pay that today, but this is in 6 months. So one important thing to note, and the examiner mentioned this in their solutions, so we'll just note the point here as well to see. When you are comparing hedging approaches, you need to be consistent of what time period you're comparing them in. Are you going to compare all the cash flows today or all the cash flows in 6 months' time? So in this case, we're going to look at all the cash flows in 6 months' time. So we need to bring forward this fee that was paid today to say, well, what's its value in 6 months' time? So you can essentially use, as the examiner said here, you can either assume that Eagle borrows any funds today, or you can assume that if they have funds on hand, that they have an opportunity cost of deposit interest foregone. So that essentially says you have a choice between using as the interest rate either the 6% or the 2.5%. Now we're going to be consistent with the solution and assume that any funds that they pay today will have to be borrowed. So the true cost for the 6 months, you have to add on that interest paid over those 6 month period. And the whole logic is you can't really add these two figures together, because one, that's the outflow in 6 months time, this is an outflow today. So to bring it forward, we do 821 times 1.03. I'd bring it forward by 3 or 6 months interest, which is 3%. So it's going to be about 845. Okay, so about 845 is the total fee. So the total cost overall is the cost of 164 plus 845. So the total cost is about 164,972. So again, there might be small rounding between the suggested solution, but I wouldn't be overly worried as long as you have the approach correctly. And the key point is here that 164,972 is the same for both scenarios. So that's why, and the examiner is very explicit here, and look at the feedback they gave. Quite a significant number of candidates failed to display an understanding that the amount payable under the forward contract would be fixed and therefore not dependent on moving the exchange rates. Therefore, all a lot of students did was, here's the cost of forward, but that's not what you were asked. You were asked for what is the cost under both scenarios. Therefore, you need to show it what is under both scenarios. And that's why a table structure like this can be very helpful to make sure it's very clear to the examiner it's the same. You've locked in a rate, so regardless of whether things are bad or whether things are good, it's always going to cost 164,972. So that's your forward rate done, and you've got the calculation. This is done in a neat appendix, and all the thing is in the final table, a page left at the front, is the two figures that you can make a comment on at the end for part B. The next one we're going to look at now is a money market hedge. So we'll do working 2, money market, and put in here working 2 so the examiner can see where it's coming from. So what a money market is, so you can only have a money market for foreign exchange. So you can see here there'll only be a money market for foreign exchange. It's where essentially instead of going directly to a bank to set up a forward rate, you can create one by borrowing and lending money in different currencies. So there's a number of key steps that you look at to figure out what I need to do for a money market. First, you ask yourself, number one, what do I need to have? And second thing then is, how do I get there? And finally then 3 is work back to today. So there's 3 main key steps. Now it will be different, slightly different depending on whether you're paying foreign currencies, in this case we're paying for Chinese yuan, or we're paying goods in Chinese yuan, or you're receiving money from making foreign exchange sales. So you have plenty of practice of whether it's a foreign exchange payable or foreign exchange receivable. But in this case, what do I need to have? Well, I have Chinese yuan bill in 6 months' time. So I want 1.2 million, I'll just do capital Y for Chinese yuan, on deposit in China in 6 months' time to offset the bill. So I want to have 1.2 million Chinese yuan on deposit in China, that should be, in 6 months' time. So that means I don't have to pay the bill, I don't have to retranslate it back. I just take my 1.2 million Chinese yuan out of the account and pay my supplier. No foreign exchange risk because I'm not translating. So how do I get there? Well, firstly, I need to deposit X amount today in a Chinese bank to ensure I have 1.2 million yuan on deposit in 6 months. So that's the first step is, well, how much do I need to deposit today? And again, I can figure that out. I need to deposit something earning an interest rate on the deposit, that's where you're told the deposit rate, of 4.5%. So the 6 month Chinese deposit rate is 4.5 divided by 2, which is 2.25%. So therefore I need to deposit something. So how much to deposit? So I deposit something today that will earn 2.25% for 6 months. That will give me 1.2 million. So I do 1.2 million divided by 1 plus the interest rate, means I need to deposit about 1.173 million yuan today to ensure that's how much I have on deposit in 6 months' time. So I need to deposit today. So that's how you work back. And then the next step is work back to today. Well, work back to today in euro terms, because that's what I want in euro terms. So 3 being then, need to spend X euro to get 1.173 million Chinese yuan. So the point is, if I need to deposit 1.17 million Chinese yuan today, how much does that mean in euro today? And of course, if it's today, I'm going to translate at the spot rate. So in euro terms, it's 1.173 divided by 7.24112. So that's euro today. And that's essentially what I want to work back towards. So to ensure I have 1.2 million Chinese yuan on deposit in 6 months' time, it results in I need to translate or exchange 162,000 euro today. And that's essentially how you work back on your money market. Start, or what do you need to have to completely offset your foreign exchange exposure. Then work out what you need to do, working all the way back to euros today. And of course, the final little trick then is, that's only in euros today, and you need to work forward for 6 months to compare like for like, because these figures are cash outflow in 6 months' time. So assuming you have to borrow that money today, that will be the equivalent of add on an additional 3% for your cost of capital for 6 months. So the total expense for the money market will be 166,936. And that's what it's going to be, 166,936. And again, don't make the mistake that a lot of students would have done, as the examiner pointed out. Quite a significant number of candidates fail to display understanding that the amount payable under the forward, which we talked about, and the money market will be fixed, and therefore not dependent on exchange rate movements. Therefore, in both scenarios, the money market is going to be the same. You have locked in any downside risk, so you're never going to have any downside risk, but you're never going to have any upside risk either, because you've essentially created a synthetic, what it's called, or a fake forward by using the money markets. So you're creating a forward, but you're not going directly to a bank. Alright, so that can be a tricky one for students to get their head around, but if you take those 2 or 3 steps, and you take it step by step, it should make it more logical in terms of how to approach it and what you need to do. So the final alternative we're looking at now is the currency options. So we go up here for working 3, options. And remember, you need to understand in English what the derivatives do before you try and do calculations. An option is what it says in the tin, it gives you more flexibility. So unlike a forward and a money market where you have a locked in rate and that's going to be there regardless of what happens, an option gives you flexibility. You can use the option if you wish. However, you can also ignore the option and take the relevant spot rate at the prevailing market rate in 6 months' time if it's more beneficial for you. So again, it comes with that added flexibility. So let's see here. We're told they can secure the quote for traded currency option. There's 6-month put options. The contract size is 200,000 Chinese yuan. You're given a strike price which is the same as the spot rate today. You have to pay a premium up front in Chinese yuan at 2.75%. So the first is, well, how many contracts do we need? We need to cover 1.2 million, and each contract is 200,000. So it's just useful to write down the number of contracts. It may or may not be needed in the calcs, but it's useful nonetheless to ensure you know that it's not just one big contract or 6 separate ones. Because they're traded, they will be standardized size. So because you have flexibility now, you will pay what's called essentially a premium up front for that flexibility. So it does come with a cost. So the premium is going to cost you 2.75% of the 1.2 million. So it's going to cost you 33,000 Chinese yuan up front. But of course, we're not interested in Chinese yuan, we're interested in euros. So that means it's going to cost you, at the spot rate today, 4,500 for the option. So that's essentially the price you pay for flexibility, 4,557. You're paying 4,500 today to have the flexibility of having the option in case you need it. Now, I tell students the easiest way to look at the option is to do out the 4 different alternatives that you have. So if we look at scenario 1, I'll just bring down these figures here. Just bring down this little table. The easiest way of looking at it is, you have essentially 2 scenarios here. Scenario 1, scenario 2. Cost using spot, cost using option. And remember, because you have the option, you can take the best of both worlds. You can take which one is more beneficial to you. Some students will be able to pick out straight away which one you'll use the option or which one you'll ignore the option. But for others, it's just as easy to run the numbers and then pick out at the end. So if we use the spot rate, we've done these calculations already. It will cost us 180,000 here and 150,000 here. So we know if we use the spot rate, we've done this before, this is typically called the unhedged, those are what the cost will be. So that's fairly straightforward. However, if we use the option and we what's called exercise the option, i.e. use our entitlement to use the rate of 7.2412, it will cost us here 165,000. Whereas if we use the option here, it will cost us the same. So remember, the option is 7.24112. So that's the rate here. We have that flexibility that now it's up to you to decide, well, in scenario 1, which one will you use? Will you ignore the option, what's called technically to let it lapse, and just use the spot rate? Well, that doesn't make sense. Because you're buying goods, you want the cheapest, so you will use the option in scenario 1. Scenario 2, then, if you use the option, it costs 165,000. But if you choose to let it lapse, in this case, it will only cost you 150,000 using the prevailing spot rate. So in scenario 1, you will what's called exercise the option, or use it, and translate at that rate, the strike price. In scenario 2, because the prevailing rate is a lot cheaper, you will ignore the option. You still have to pay the premium, but you will use the spot rate. And notice again, I'll come back to the point that we talked about before. Whichever scenario you're afraid of happening is more than likely when you're going to exercise the option. So here we were afraid of the Chinese yuan appreciating, so you're more than likely going to exercise the option in scenario where you have appreciation. So that's consistent with our fear. So these are the 2 costs you're going to use, the 165 and the 150. So the way to think about the option is you get the best of both worlds. You get to choose whether you want to use the option price, 7.24112, or you get to choose whether you want to use the prevailing spot rate. So add to that then the fee, or what's called the premium. So the premium is today's euro, but we need to figure out what it is in 6 months' time, because these are the cash flows in 6 months' time. So we need to compare like to like. So the updated premium will be then 4557 times 1.03 to bring it forward 6 months to include any interest foregone, or should I say interest paid, because we had to borrow that amount up front. So we're just trying to compare it like for like. So we add the 165,4694. So the cost here is 170,414, and the cost here, if we do that again, it'll be the same amount because the premium is the same in either one, is 155. So notice the key point is here, regardless of whether we use the option in scenario 1 or we don't use the option, you have to pay the premium. So that's like an insurance premium. Even if you don't use the insurance policy, you have to pay it up front. So we look at here then, the option for scenario 1 will cost 170, and the option for scenario 2 then will cost 155. So that is essentially, we have now finished, let's put it up here, we have now finished part A. It asks us to calculate the net cost of the goods for each of the 3 scenarios, or 3 options over 2 scenarios. So that's the 6 figures that they want. Now we go to part B, and you see the benefit now of having a neat table is we can make very neat comments on the first page, and you don't have to look or find through any of the calculations here with what was the figure for the money market, etc. It's nice and neat here, and we just make some smart comments and give a recommendation for 3 marks. So in terms of making some comments, well, clearly we'll ignore this unhedged now for now because that was not part of the question. But again, if there was unhedged here, just one clear comment that you make is there's a lot of uncertainty here. There's a big swing at 34,000, which again, unless they were happy to take on that risk, it wouldn't really be feasible to leave yourself exposed to that, because it could wipe out a lot of the profits on any transaction. So if we look at here, some of the comments we'd make are both the forward and money market give certainty in terms of what the outcome will be. So you know there's only a slight difference with the money market being a bit dearer. However, one important point, you'll see these in past questions as well, is that both of these are over-the-counter traded. Therefore, there is counterparty risk. That whoever you enter into the transaction with, either the forward or the money market, you must ensure the creditworthiness of those parties before you enter into them. Because if the deal falls through, you will still be left with the exposure and you'll have no hedging in place. Sorry there. The benefit of the option, however, is that it's traded. In that case, it's centrally traded. There's no counterparty risk because you're dealing with an exchange. And in that case, it does have a benefit that's a less risk involved. Now, it is slightly more expensive in the worst case scenario to 170, but you can see there's a big uplift here that if the currency does depreciate, you can have a big benefit. So that is one of the advantages of having an option, in that case, that it doesn't lock you in. It hedges the downside risk, but if there is favorable movements, you can take advantage of that. So on a broad level here, while there isn't major difference between all of them, you're more than likely probably going to, on balance, use the currency options as your most appropriate technique. 1, because there's no counterparty risk, and 2, because although slightly dearer here, the overall, on balance, it does give you exposure to upside potential, which again can be beneficial. So that's all you're looking for. A couple of 3 or 4 lines, 3 or 4 smart comments with a clear recommendation should get you your 3 marks. And finally then, it's more critically, part C is a more narrative question. Critically assess the arguments made by Alan and Emma regarding to hedge currency exposures and advise an appropriate policy. So the point is here, you have to go up and you have to critically assess, look at the pros and cons of both. So essentially the arguments are, 1, Alan says it's too expensive, and essentially all movements in foreign exchange are risky or are random anyway, and you can't predict them, and there's no point in hedging. Emma's, the alternative, says, look, this is too big of a transaction not to hedge, it exposes us to too much risk, and whatever the costs involved, they're justified. So again, have a look at the suggested solution. It does it well in terms of explaining it. The key point is you need to address both the pros and cons of Alan and Emma, and then come down off the fence at the end and advise an appropriate policy. Realistically here, it's more than likely you're going to have to implement some hedging policy because of the size of the transaction and the potential impact an adverse swing in foreign exchange rates could have on the overall business. Right, but again, there is narrative as well as the more calculative questions in risk management. There can be narrative questions, and you need to be comfortable with both because that represents 5% of your paper. So to look at some of just a brief examiner feedback that we've looked at before, typically in past years, risk management has been the most poor performing question for students. However, this year, the examiner was pleasantly surprised in terms of the overall mark, and also was the second highest scoring question. So that was very well. It was very good to see. So as well as that, you can see here, we talked about many students were very good, and they picked up quite a few marks of the computation. So again, this was because if you practice past questions, it's a very common structure the question comes up, and there was nothing new in this that should have faced students who had put the practice in. Again, students were well able to answer the questions, particularly in terms of the narrative, and give some recommendation as to which one was the most suitable. Watch out for here, part C. Part was well answered, albeit largely with textbook material. So that's one thing you need to watch out, particularly for the narrative questions. Remember, the examiner knows this is an open book exam. They're not going to structure or accept answers that are merely just regurgitation of textbook answers. So try as much as possible to apply to the facts of the case. For example, here, bring in the Chinese context, bring in the size of the consignment involved as well. All of those are factors that the examiner will have intentionally put into the case for students to be able to use to improve their answer and put some context on their answer specific to the case. Alright, so overall that is Summer 16, question 4, looking at foreign exchange risk management.